Okay. Hi, everybody. Yep, I'm Leo. I am the team leader for the BBI project under the research agenda or umbrella of the state of authoritarianism and democracy in Asia. I am a third-year anthropology student, and the title of our paper is Ideology, Technology, and Health Policy, Democracy and Authoritarianism in the Context of COVID-19. I think we're going to go through and introduce everybody on this first slide. So I think, Jasreen, if you want to go up next.
Hi everyone, I'm Jasreen and I'm a first year economics student.
Hey everyone, I'm a FEC. I'm a first year politics and IR student.
Hi everyone, I'm Aiden. I'm a second year history student.
And I'm Hugo, and I'm a second year history student as well.
All right, awesome. So with that being said, let's get right into it. Our project, just to give an overview and introduction, is focusing on 3 polities of interest and 3 themes of interest in the context of studying political regimes in Asia. We wanted to include the topic of COVID-19 in our project because of its relevance in both just contemporary consciousness and in what we believe to be the future of politics and ideology and forms of human governance. So just to briefly go over the reasons we picked these 3 countries. Our 3 countries are, as you guys can see on the flags or polities, China, Taiwan, and India. China, in our minds, is one of the most important global players in international relations, but also probably the most important country when it comes to the state of democracy and authoritarianism in Asia. We think that it was worth studying because there has been an increasing amount of fear and also just a relevance of the discourse related to their ideologies and forms of governance in comparison with the West. Our second region of interest is Taiwan, which we think offers an interesting counterpoint to China because of the strength of its democracy, as we'll get into it in a little bit, and its unique position in between China and America. And the final country we've chosen to research is India. India is, in our view, an underappreciated and understudied country in the context of COVID. It provides a really fascinating case study when it comes to how public health policy, technology, and political regimes / ideology come into contact with one another, and we'll get much more into that later. The 3 themes of interest are given in our title earlier, but they are ideology, public health policy, and digital technology. I included the picture of Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, because that is a very important guiding principle in our research project, the idea that liberal democracy has triumphed as the final political ideology of human governance, and that the Soviet Union, Communist China are all failed experiments that are just waiting to be subsumed by history-ending wave of liberalism and democracy. We want to get into this and evaluate the relevance of this thought and see its policy repercussions for international relations and for these Asian countries, which are very much not liberal and sometimes not democratic. The other theme is coronavirus public health policy. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but it's a fascinating part of politics right now in the way that public health is conceptualized, who the economy is meant to serve, and how different trade-offs are made between health, freedom, privacy, etc. And the final topic is digital surveillance, digital technology. We've included because I'm sure many of you know there's been increasing concerns about track and trace, about surveillance, and the different technologies rolled out across the globe. And we find that there are immense disparities in the strategies taken by different countries. And we thought that a comparison in the digital strategies of these countries in dealing with coronavirus and evaluating how this relates to their political regime will be an interesting theme of policy research. So to get to the next slide, I'm just going to give a brief introduction of our paper. We are not going to give you a holistic summary because that's boring, but we want to explain why we did what we did. And hopefully in that process, you guys will learn something about the lessons we learned, the problems we faced, and the conclusions we reached based on our methodology, not just our findings. So we add the structure of the paper is introduction. We have chapter 1 is historical perspectives. Chapter 2 is contemporary analysis and comparison. You'll see what that means in a second. Chapter 3, we've titled What Comes Next, and provides a policy perspective towards the future. Finally, limitations, recommendations, conclusion, pretty straightforward. So kicking it off is going to be chapter 1.
Yes. The first thing basically in chapter 1, we asked ourselves, what can institutional and political histories of our 3 countries tell us about the present? And first, in order to gain like a firm understanding of the institutional histories of our case studies, we made use of index scores of democracy, authoritarianism, and state capacity. And through examining the Fragile State Index, the Polity Index, and the Freedom House Index, we managed to shape an understanding of the institutions that we are concerned with. And onwards to the next slide, we will explain a little bit more about other things that we did in trying to get a historical perspective.
So in the case of India, there are 2 elements that are kind of central to understanding India's response to the COVID pandemic. And the first one would be the importance of the Dharma and Karma concept, where every individual in society is ascribed a role, and they, through their karma, they pursue this role. And so therefore that means that in Indian society, unlike in Western political thought, the community prevails over the individual. And that's some kind of recurring theme we will see throughout our analysis in the subsequent chapters. And then the kind of second element of Indian political thought that is also important to our understanding is the kind of incorporation of certain Western elements, such as liberalism, welfarism, which are also important in understanding how the Indian government pursues its public health policy, as well as its digital surveillance of the population policy.
For China, there are also 2 important themes. That is the experiment with democracy in the 1980s that was brought about the economic reforms in 1978, and post-1989 transformation of relationship between the state and the people. So both are essential to our understanding of how China approached the dissent and crisis in the state, as well as some of the general mode of behavior and motives seen in China during the pandemic.
For Taiwan, its democratic political culture is evident from how civil society's organizations have the ability to scrutinize and criticize government policies, and the Taiwan political leaders have responded to such public criticism in a timely fashion, implementing quick adjustments to existing policies. This has reinforced trust in Taiwan's public institutions and gave rise to the notion of socialization, where citizens work hand in hand with the government to tackle national issues.
Right. So chapter 2, we had to ask ourselves, how have contemporary events revealed how different political regimes confront public health crises? And first, we had to look at SARS as a case study for how regimes tackle public health crises. And we put forward a comparison with Singapore and Hong Kong on how digital technology was used during the epidemic back in the early 2000s. Our main interest was to find how the use of local and national lockdowns, surveillance, public identity, and public pressure shaped a response to a public health crisis. And we, onwards, we sort of did a comparison with COVID from this understanding that we gained.
The most important point of comparison was the narrative of the so-called authoritarian advantage. So in the context of SARS, we compared the response of Taiwan and China. So the authoritarian advantage is basically the narrative that authoritarian states have a bigger capacity and capability to respond to crisis, or more specifically, public health crisis. But our comparison shows that that might not necessarily be the case for SARS, and it's more evident when we compare with COVID as well.
In the second part of chapter 2, we started looking at track and trace systems to track kind of the COVID pandemic, to bring about a discussion about the ongoing conflict between effectiveness and privacy in addressing this pandemic. And to look at this discussion, we used at MIT's COVID tracker review, which basically enables us to look at how different countries have put in place their tracking systems and how they're different. And in this analysis, we also incorporated 2 small case studies, which are South Korea as well as Singapore, to also show that even in kind of democracies or authoritarian states, there are different types of responses, and democracies such as South Korea have used some authoritarian approaches in their response to the COVID pandemic.
We also looked at how China has leveraged on the COVID-19 pandemic to expand its digital authoritarian model. As governments worldwide sought to control the spread of the coronavirus by harnessing technology, China has sought to export its surveillance technology abroad. And what is often interesting is that Chinese digital technologies employ an invasive degree of data mining to extract the identities of its citizens. Massive amounts of personal data collected are subsequently accessed by the authorities to expand its public surveillance efforts.
And then finally, we looked at India to see how a country's response to the pandemic, what can this tell us basically about the current values that there are in a certain society. And through looking at India, we saw that there has been a withering away of democratic and secular values that kind of existed in the preceding decades. But we have also seen a reemergence of solidarity, humanism, and civic activism, even though there are some very persistent inequalities in Indian society. But I think the most important lesson we have seen from looking at India is that some countries, such as India, have had health as a secondary objective in their response to the pandemic. Because in India, we have seen that Narendra Modi and the BJP have basically used their response to the pandemic to pursue their Hindu nationalist agenda rather than really addressing the health issues of their population.
Right. So chapter 3, a very dramatic what comes next. Here we try to attempt to find how we can trace the trajectories of ideological, technological, and policy development into the future. So we try to understand basically how ideology, technology, and policy are bound to be developed in Asia, and specifically in the countries that we are concerned with. And we examined recent Chinese lockdowns, what they signify. We looked at mass diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, in China's economic and diplomatic battle with the West, and what we can sort of assume will come next, and why this is important.
So the other part that we examined is the poll data and government, basically domestic and international perceptions of how these governments respond to the pandemic. So we sought to examine the importance of domestic perceptions and international reputation to these 3 countries or any other countries in the world in general. So the lesson is that while some governments might not necessarily or like objectively do have a solid or sound pandemic response, the perceptions that emerge out of these events can have very contradictory results. So for example, with China, even though they were able to put down the pandemic quite effectively in the later stages, the international community was quite suspicious of how China went about it. And on the other hand, while India had one of the highest number of cases in the world, the domestic perceptions of the government was a generally good one. So the contradictions that we examine here kind of like reviews an issue for these governments to handle in the future.
On the other hand, the Taiwanese government has been viewed favorably by the Taiwanese people, which is in line with international sentiments. We will say that Taiwan's competent handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has led to it being viewed as a model for nations worldwide tackling the public health crisis, and this has boosted its soft power and international reputation.
All right, so that is the overview of our topics that we selected to research. We are going to turn to methodology next to discuss the different techniques and approaches we tried to take. The main thing we want everyone to keep in mind while we're talking about this is a problem that is stated above. How do we conduct a policy analysis on a set of events that is so recent, that is so difficult to quantify, and that has so many conflicting perspectives and stakeholders? So our solution, which is not complete by any means, consists of the following 4 points, and my team will introduce them now.
Yeah, so the first, and as we noted previously, is indexes. So we examined indexes and we made inferences from the scores of the different countries that we looked at. And since indexes literally quantify abstract themes like democracy or stability or quality of public health infrastructure and others, basically we could gain like a quantitative understanding of our interested themes, while in general we had a very qualitative understanding. So we tried to sort of make inferences from the indexes that we looked at.
So for historical analysis, most of it was historical because of the ongoing nature of the pandemic. It seems to be quite difficult to isolate the events because none of the we're not quite distant from the current event, so we might be biased. So by introducing a historical perspective, we could trace some of the motives and mode of behavior of these governments and provide some grounding to the study that was quite otherwise chaotic and recent.
And as a group, and we study very different subjects, and I think that's been reflected in this research paper and in our research and analysis through its like multidisciplinary approach. We have used a variety of sources ranging from academia, from economists. We have also looked at journalism, government data. We have also interviewed some academics, particularly in the sector of public health. So we have really tried to look at all the disciplines that there are in social sciences and the humanities to basically widen our scope and push our analysis even further.
Lastly, we conducted analysis of government statements and public poll results as we wanted to understand how actual sentiments on the ground differed from that of views of academia and government officials.
So these are, what we're talking about next is the things we learned in trying to use these 4 methods. So what does our approach in specific teach us about how our themes determine how different political regimes respond to health crisis, and what do they mean for the future of policy study in this general theme topic?
Yeah. So once again, with indexes, we sort of wanted to get some background perspective going into it, and we did it to basically contextualize our mainly qualitative analysis and get a more holistic picture of the institutions and the state behavior of the countries we're concerned with. So, for example, we found that Taiwan has a 10 out of 10 polity index democracy score, while China has a high autocracy score. And we basically use these inferences to push our analysis further.
So for history, the most important things are the motives and mode of behavior of the state, as previously mentioned. So some of the examples that are evident include China's how China managed dissent and handled the crisis. So their priorities are to maintain political stability and maintain economic growth. And then for Taiwan, the historical socio-political structure played heavily into the pandemic's response. So it's important that we examine the historical perspectives.
And through our multidisciplinary approach, we've really tried to understand the different stakeholders that have been involved in this crisis, whether it's the population, the government, the private sector, the public sector. And we think it's important to take a multitude of perspectives into account because this enables us to see how this coronavirus pandemic has been negotiated differently in different parts of the world. And it also helps us to understand that there are differing perspectives on each of events and kind of moderate our response. Whereas if we had just used one type of discipline, it would have sidelined some of the important findings we have made in our paper.
Lastly, by comparing public polls with government statements and academia perspective, we notice a difference between civilian reactions and the official government narratives in India and China, and this is often shaped by the social and cultural factors.
All right, so we are going to discuss super briefly, I know because we're running out of time, so one sentence each, guys, the limitations that we faced in going into this project.
So the most important one would be, again, the ongoing nature of the pandemic. So many news sources are coming out all the time, so there were quite a few instances that we have to change our findings.
We also suffered from a lack of quantitative data. As Aidan said, cases are not complete in any of the 3 countries we studied. A lot of the data and information about government surveillance is black boxed for good reason or bad reasons, but whatever. And finally, it is very hard, as Afek has mentioned, to find a way to create data points out of democratic and authoritarian spectrums or gradients.
Yeah. Also, we have cultural and political biases. So since we come from different backgrounds, we have varying political opinions. We do different courses. We're bound to have individual biases going into this.
Furthermore, we only looked at Anglophone sources, which might not be representative of the situation in India, China, and Taiwan.
And finally, whilst doing our initial research, we basically saw that there was a lot more content regarding China rather than Taiwan and India. And this maybe reveals some sort of Western obsession with China, but it was a little bit more problematic to find sources that were relating to India and Taiwan.
Okay, so to run briefly over our policy recommendations and our analysis, because I know we're running short on time. We organized our recommendations by country, and we hope that creating a framework or an interpretive framework for looking at the future of Asian politics. Something would emerge from each country together to provide an overarching framework or policy perspective on this region. So in India, as Hugo has highlighted, cultural dispositions towards intrusive government could set the stage for Hindu nationalism, and urban decay has been problematized by certain cultural values as well as by the policies of the state government, and pose an extreme problem for reform in public health. So we don't have any direct solutions because these are huge problems, but economic mobilization and a reinvigoration of the value of conflicting cultural perspectives, we think would be a good start. In terms of China, they have, as Aidan has mentioned, attempted to utilize this crisis to legitimize and expand their sphere of influence, and this has hampered their ability to deal with crisis, both domestically and in terms of their international relations. We also argue that ideology has been harnessed by both sides of the equation, by China and by the West, to twist this international crisis into a tool of antagonistic diplomacy. In our opinion, international collaboration is necessary and is an important value to reinstill in Chinese relations with the rest of the world. And in the context of Taiwan, just Jazreen has eloquently argued in the paper, civic engagement, trust in governance, and accountability are all three very powerful supplements to democracy that strengthen both the liberal ideals and democratic forms of governance. And also they serve to reconcile them because they have increasingly in recent times come into conflict, that is liberalism and democracy. So the bottom line, with that being said, ideology, technology, and public health policy are key to understanding how the globe will move forward in the post-COVID world, and especially how Asian politics will move forward in the post-COVID world. So with that being said, we're going to run briefly over, conclusions. I think we can skip this slide completely. These are the 5 themes we talked about. They're deeply interconnected. We wanted to draw out how and why and how COVID will change this, and what we can learn from the transformations that have occurred in the past 12 months to create a way of challenging certain assumptions about how the world should be organized or will be organized, and ultimately to challenge Francis Fukuyama's idea that history has ended and that the West has been triumphant. So with that being said, we want to thank you guys for your attention. We hope you guys enjoyed our interwoven presentation, which was supposed to reflect our collaborative approach to our research, which I think went really well. I'm very proud of my team. We worked very well together. We overcame a lot of challenges and individual perspectives to create something that was really nice. I also want to thank BBI for putting something like this together. I want to thank our peer reviewers. I want to thank the admin team, and I want to especially thank our trustee, who I know has been putting in a tremendous amount of work to help us to organize our project, to contribute to our policy takeaways, but also just to organize the entirety of this think tank. So yeah, thank you everybody for your attention. We are going to be signing off now because we're a little bit over time, but that's it.